Today's episode features a really scary and highly disturbing camping story involving a group of Boy Scouts. But before we get into it, if you enjoy my narration of various mysterious and strange stories, then I would appreciate it if you would consider subscribing to the channel. With that being said, let's get into it. It's the year 1920. A police car is driving through the region of Ablemore County in Virginia. The two police officers were sent out to check on a group of Boy Scouts that went missing in the region the day before. While driving through the woods, they suddenly see a young man lying next to the street. The man was curled up and was wearing a Boy Scout uniform, his badges indicating that he is a Boy Scout group leader. An ambulance was called, and 30 minutes later, the man was transported to the hospital. While waiting for the ambulance, the officers tried to communicate with the man in order to understand what had happened to him and the other missing Boy Scouts. The man was struggling to speak, and the only word he managed to utter before getting transported was Dunlora House. Later, they would interrogate this Boy Scout leader and learn that he had experienced a night of pure terror, a night that left him the sole survivor of the missing Boy Scouts. So what happened to the man, and what is the Dunlora House he kept referring to? In order to understand what happened that night, we have to go back further in time. Located in Virginia, there's a small town called Dunlora Plantation. Ever since this place was founded, it was considered a community for rather wealthy individuals. Today, the town is filled with big houses, beautiful gardens, and modern infrastructure. But there is also an old gravel path leading into the woods. If you follow this path, you will be surrounded by dead trees with unique white wood, and that never grow any leaves, no matter the season. At some point, you will reach a property, the so-called Dunlora property, and on this property, you will see the aptly named Dunlora House. It was constructed in 1724 by Major Thomas Carr, man most famous for being the brother-in-law of Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson obviously being one of the founding fathers as well as the third president of the United States. Despite Carr's wealth and the large property, the Dunlora House itself was rather modest. Besides this house, the Dunlora property had a small park and a graveyard, primarily filled with the remains of former slaves. However, back then, there was nothing weird about this house. It was just another rich white man's plantation. If anything, some of the residents of Dunlora Plantation were perplexed by the fact that Carr had built his home deep inside the forest. In modern photos, many of the trees have been cut down, but back then the place looked like a cliché horror movie forest. Only with the beginning of the 20th century did this place begin to attract an evil reputation. This was primarily linked to this house's last owner. The old woman lived a solitary life, was rather creepy, and most residents actually considered her to be a witch. Primarily because people claimed to have seen strange lights emanating from the Dunlora house late at night. I also have to note, when I say witch, I don't mean the cliché fairy tale witch flying on a broom. Back then, they considered this old woman to be an occultist, performing satanic rituals inside this house. Prior to her moving into the house, this property had been a popular destination for short hikes, but these rumors scared people away. People who did enter this area reported sighting of shadow creatures lurking in the forest, strange lights and satanic rituals taking place in the house's vicinity. Interestingly, after the woman died, this phenomenon became even more prominent. more and more strangers began to visit the town and secretly visited the house. One time, a group of local residents had enough of this and secretly followed such a group. According to them, they witnessed a satanic ritual taking place in the woods. Supposedly, these strangers were wearing black robes, had lighted a large fire, and even sacrificed a young woman. However, when the witnesses reported this to the police, they dismissed them immediately. There's actually a theory regarding why the police never acted on these rumors, but that's something we will talk about later on. Either way, after about 20 years of these strange occurrences, there was one incident far more disturbing and brutal than anything else witnessed in the area. Which brings us to the disturbing camping trip of a Boy Scout group in July 1920. 6 Boy Scouts, aged 12 to 14, and their 21-year-old Boy Scout leader, Martin Cassell, embarked on a hiking trip near Dunlora Plantation. Their group wasn't from the region, and they only hiked there as part of a larger activity. Their entire Boy Scout troop had split up into several groups who were all tasked with creating their own hiking route leading back to their original camp. This was also the reason why the police had searched for them just one day after they disappeared, because the other groups obviously knew each group's route, and when they didn't return, it was obvious that something must have happened. This particular group had accidentally planned their route in such a way that they would be camping near the Dunlora House, a decision they would come to regret. According to the leader's testimony, this is what happened. At first, their hike was going down as expected. The weather was good, and everyone was in high spirits. They arrived at their destination and set up camp. What they didn't realize was that they were not just camping near the Dunlora property, but they had accidentally entered the part of the forest belonging to the Dunlora property. Since they were not from the region and the internet was not yet invented, they obviously had no idea of this property's dark backstory. They set up 4 tents, 3 tents for 2 Boy Scouts each and 1 for the leader, before starting a campfire. And this is another really tragic part of this story, because they didn't even have s'mores. Instead, they had to roast potatoes on a stick. Ironically, they then began to tell scary stories to each other. Ironic, because they were just hours away from suffering a fate far worse than most horror stories mention. Around 10 p.m., they all went to sleep in order to get enough energy for the next day. During the night, their leader was awoken by a strange noise. He got up, left his tent, and wanted to check if everything was okay. But the 6 boys were nowhere to be found. The whole forest was completely silent, except for Cassell screaming their names. Finally, he grabbed his flashlight and went deeper into the forest, hoping to find the boys. At some point, they spotted a faint light flickering between the trees. Thinking that these must be the missing boys, he followed the light and eventually entered a large clearing. This is when he came face to face with an old, abandoned house, the Dunlora House. He saw lights flickering behind one of the windows, and it seemed like it was emanating from several candles. Since the door was already open, he assumed that the boys must have discovered the abandoned place and decided to investigate it. Despite being creeped out by the whole situation, he decided that he had to enter this house. Once inside, he searched every room, and while he did find the recently lit candles, there was no trace of the boys. When he called out for them, he was just met with silence. There was only one place left that he didn't check out yet, the basement. He gathered his courage and went down the old stairs leading to the dark basement. Without his flashlight, he wouldn't have been able to see anything in this room. This is when he found something lying on the floor. It was a hat belonging to one of his Boy Scouts, confirmed by both the hat's design and the name written on it. At this point, he was more than creeped out, because now he had confirmation that the boys must have been inside this house, but now they were nowhere to be found. When he heard a strange giggle, he turned and saw something that made his blood freeze. Just inches away stood an old woman. She looked unnaturally creepy and had a deranged smile. Upon seeing this, he immediately fled the scene. While running up the stairs, he wondered if that was just the owner of the house, but he was too afraid to find that out. He finally reached the front door and jumped on the lawn surrounding the house. But after running several feet, he fell. When he turned around, he realized that he had stumbled over the dead body of one of the boys. He was topless, and his upper body had been cut open, his innards spread all over. Now that he stopped a second to take a better look, he realized that this body wasn't the only one. All of the boys were lying on the ground, and all had similar wounds. This discovery shocked him, and he wasn't able to move. Not until he once again heard crazy laughs coming from the house. The old lady was standing in the front door, laughing at him and licking blood from her fingers. Upon seeing that, he ran towards the tree line and just kept running until he eventually passed out. It was later calculated that he had laid there for 10 hours before the police found him. After his interrogation, the local police were understandably shocked and immediately launched another search party. But what they found in the forest didn't match the story Cassell had told them. They did find the bodies of the 6 murdered Boy Scouts, but they were inside their tents, not on the Dunlora property. Their wounds matched what the leader had described to them, but the scene was completely different. They were all found in their own sleeping bags, and it was proven that some of the organs had been burned in the campfire before it went out. But the most peculiar thing they found was a knife belonging to the Boy Scout leader. His knife was bloody, and based on this discovery, they blamed the leader for the murders. He was subsequently arrested and sentenced to life in prison, and then sent to a mental asylum, still claiming that the witch was responsible for the boys' deaths. At least if you believe that this story ever happened, because now we get to a weird issue. There are no official reports of the police or the courts that this event ever took place. However, when you ask families who have always lived in this town, then they will firmly insist that all of this really went down in 1920. And while this could be a lie to keep the town's history interesting, there are in fact 2 diaries from the 1920s that might offer an answer to this mystery. One of the diaries belonged to a teenage girl, and she wrote, quote, "Never again will I or anyone else enter this property. God have mercy on the boys' souls." Since she is talking about boys in plural, and this diary entry was written just days after this event supposedly took place, it is more than likely that the girl is referring to this mass murder. Then again, if the adults at the time spun this urban legend, the girl could have been influenced by all the talk. However, there is one theory that suggests that this story is true, but that it was covered up. When different authors and journalists tried to research this case in modern times, they noticed something strange. All the case files regarding June of 1920, as well as all the court documents of this month, were missing. There is no official explanation for that, but strangely, every official document regarding this time period is nowhere to be found. And if you remember, I hinted at the fact that the police had ignored reports regarding Dunlora House. Now, you might be asking why the local authorities would cover up cases related to this house. Well, according to some people, it all goes back to who built this house. I already mentioned that Thomas Carr was Thomas Jefferson's brother-in-law. As a result, the name Thomas Jefferson was always connected to this house's history. The theory suggests that patriots in the area decided that even though these murders happened 200 years after Thomas Jefferson's death, satanic rituals and mass murders should never be connected to one of the founding fathers. In a way, they wanted to make sure that his reputation wouldn't be sullied in any way, even though covering a murder case 200 years later would still be a pretty extreme measure. Although destroying the case files would definitely be an effective way to sweep this under the rug. Even if the locals would keep on spreading the story, it wouldn't matter because now you could just downplay the whole thing as an urban legend. And while this explanation would be a complete overkill, it is strange that these specific case files went missing. I am really looking forward to hearing your opinion on this matter, and if this theory is valid or completely crazy, like so many other conspiracy theories. Today, the house has been bought by an anonymous buyer who plans to take it down. There are no official plans, but apparently something with a more friendlier reputation is supposed to be constructed on the site. With that, today's episode comes to an end. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to check out the rest of my channel. There, I have amassed even more creepy stories that sound an awful lot like this one. Stay safe, and I will see you in the next one.